This happened over a decade ago, somewhere in northern Michigan during the summer. My friend Kathy, 18, my boyfriend's half-sister May, 16, and I, 17, drove down our hometown to visit friends, and we were on our way back in Kathy's shitty little Geo. By shitty, I'm talking the piece of crap had engine problems, overheating problems, ignition problems, and was constantly falling apart. More than once, it had stalled or just stopped working in the middle of the street while we were trying to get somewhere. But Kathy thought we'd be fine since we hadn't any problems with it on the way to our friend's house. It's a little past midnight, and we're roughly an hour away from home. There's nobody on the road. Dense woods on every side, no streetlights, no moon. I can barely see past the windshield because I have a form of albinism, which leaves me legally blind in my left eye and with really awful vision in my right eye. My depth perception is terrible and I can't see more than a few feet ahead of me at most. But usually I can make out lights and other cars when they pass, and sometimes street signs, and people when they're close enough. We drove down this narrow, hilly road, and on the descent down a hill, the Geo makes a strange sound. Kathy starts braking, and when we get to the bottom of the hill, the car quits working. Kathy swears and turns on the hazard lights. She and I get out of the vehicle. I help pop the hood, which causes a bunch of smoke to fly out. After the smoke mostly clears, Kathy tries to figure out what went wrong this time. We stand in the dark for at least 45 minutes, maybe longer, before we realized we couldn't fix the car and needed a tow truck. These were the days of MapQuest printouts and brick phones, so we couldn't whip out our smartphone and look up the closest tow truck. I decided to call my boyfriend, Caleb, to come pick us up, and suggest we come with a tow to pick up the Geo when it was daylight. May and Kathy agree, so I take out my crappy Nokia and call my boyfriend. It's then I realize I have no service. I asked May and Kathy if either of them have service. They both shake their heads. May gets a bit panicky, and we hold our phones up, trying to get a signal to no avail. It's hot as hell, and after failing to get any kind of service, we're all feeling a bit spooked and uncomfortable. May begs us to do something, because she's more afraid than Kathy and I. Kathy attempts to calm May down, and I wonder if the thick woods and hills are blocking our reception. I tell May and Kathy to wait by the car and walk away from them up the hill we had just come down. Holding my phone out, still no signal, I walk further and further away until I reach the top of the hill. I can't see the outline of the Geo anymore, but I can still hear May at a distance. Even at the top of the hill, I don't get a signal. I know it's gotta be the trees in the way, so I get the idea of climbing up a tree and calling from there, just to see if it works. In hindsight, this was not my brightest idea, but me being an idiot, I saunter off into the woods in search of a climbable tree. At this point, I just want to go home, and this is the only thing on my mind. I find a nice one with low branches and lift my body upwards toward the trunk. I climb the branches higher and higher, and about midway up the tree, I feel my pack of cigarettes fall out of my shorts pocket. Kind of annoyed, but I figure I can just look for them when I climb back down. I take my phone out and I hold it up once I get near the top. I got service. Relieved, I call Caleb. He doesn't pick up, so I call again until he does. He answers in a sleepy, pissed voice, but I'm having none of that and simply explain our situation. He asks where we are and I give him the name of the road, my best guess as to how far along we are on it. He says he'll be on his way and tells me to go back and wait with May and Kathy, then yells at me for being stupid and climbing a tree in the dark with my depth perception. I assure him that I'm fine. He's skeptical but says okay. I hung up. I start climbing down the tree, but my hand touches a big glob of sap, so I stop and try to wipe the sticky goop off on my shirt. I'm already sweaty and gross, so I'm not too happy about the sap. While I'm failing at getting this crap off my hands, I hear the strangest sound from below me. I completely freeze, not being able to place what that sound is, but it's moving pretty fast. I stare down into the darkness below, but I can't see shit. Just hear this noise continuing. It comes closer and closer, and then I hear it right below my tree. And then it stops, right under my tree. I hold on to the branch as tight as I can and wait. I hear leaves shuffling and twigs snapping, and after a while that stops, and the weird noise starts again, but it's heading away from me, deeper into the woods. I wait until I can no longer hear the sound, then finish climbing down and jump out of the tree. It's completely silent now, besides the sounds of the woods. So I grope around on the ground for my cigarettes. I don't find them, so I make my way out of the woods and back towards the road. I jog down the hill. When I reach the bottom, I notice May and Kathy aren't standing outside the car anymore, and the hazard lights are off. I walk over to the car and May rolls down the window a little bit and whispers in a panicked voice, "Elizabeth, where the hell are you?" I point back over my shoulder towards the hill and started to explain that I called my brother, but Kathy yelled, "What are you doing? Get the fuck back in the car!" I gave them a weird look, but May unlocks and opens the door. I crawl back into the seat with her, slamming it behind me. Kathy slams the locks and double checks them while May rolls up the window and makes sure the rest are rolled up. One of the windows is never closed all the way, but there's less than a finger space, so it's not too big a deal. But May is freaking out about it. Kathy has lost her cool as well. I'm so confused and ask what the hell is going on. May tells me that a bit after I went up to the hill, some weird person came out of the woods and ran really funny up the hill in the direction I went. They got freaked out and turned the lights off and got in the car. They thought he had got me. I'm honestly scared at this point, because if I hadn't stopped to wipe sap off my hands, I most likely would have got out of the tree at the time I heard the weird noise. I just knew it was that person. I told them the story and everybody in the car is scared shitless, but are relieved that Caleb is on the way. We only have to play the waiting game now. We sit on the road for what seems like forever. The dread we were feeling made it seem like it was going slower and slower by the minute. Kathy and May are looking out the windows, surveying the area, and I'm just sitting here, hoping Caleb will hurry the fuck up and come rescue us. Suddenly, I hear May whine. "Oh my god." She starts crying. Kathy snaps her head to where May is looking and stifles a gasp. I look where they're facing. I see nothing but the dark. But then I hear it through a small opening in the window. May ducks down, as though doing that will make her invisible, and Kathy hides her head behind the steering wheel. I follow their lead and sort of hunch down in my seat, but the noise comes straight up to the window. I can almost make out the silhouette of a tall, skinny man, but then he presses his face against May's window, and I finally see him. Nobody screams. You'd think we would, but it didn't happen. We all just stared at each other. He looked in at us for a while until Kathy switched her brights on, hoping it would scare him off. It didn't. The dude just walked in front of the car and stood in front of the headlights. Maybe he thought he could block us from leaving? I don't know. I couldn't make out his features very well, but the guy had to have been somewhere a bit over 6 foot and no older than 30. He had the face of your average Joe. Nothing special. Nothing really sinister or particularly creepy that you'd notice about him if you ran into this dude in broad daylight. Dark shaved, pale skin, long face. May said he had light colored eyes and stubble with his eyebrows that made him look like he was always concerned. But there was no way that I could make that out, so I had to take her word for it. What was really weird was it was like 80 degrees and this guy was wearing corduroys. That explains the sound, and an oversized sweater with abnormally long sleeves. The sleeves went over his hands and flopped back and forth as he paced around in front of the Geo. I'm not sure how long he was in front of the car, but it was a while. Then good old Corduroy starts doing something really bizarre. He bends his arm towards his face, which I can only describe as looking like a praying mantis, because of the way his sleeves were hanging, and then he begins walking circles around the car, rhythmically, taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, like goddamn Willy Wonka, but on speed or something. By now, May was sobbing and Kathy seemed like she had to vomit, so I felt like I had to be the brave one. I looked at the slight space in the open window, and when he orbited his way over there, I said, "Hey man, can you just stop? You're really freaking us out." Corduroy definitely heard me, so he wished to halt and looked back into the car through the windshield, straight at me. I asked him very firmly to leave, and he took an extended pause, smiled, then Willy Wonka'd his way out of my line of vision, into the darkness. After a while, Kathy said he disappeared into the woods, and May said, "I can't believe that worked." We awkwardly laughed about that, a weirdo he was and glad he left and whatever. We went back to waiting for Caleb, somewhat reassured but still paranoid. But after some time, Kathy said, "Oh no, he's back." I couldn't see, but apparently he was doing the 2 steps forward, 1 step back parallel to us on one side of the road, and this time he had a big tree branch he was holding with his sweater-covered hands. May got scared, and I held her hand so she'd feel better about it, even though I was ready to shit myself. It was awful, because I didn't know if he was coming toward us, or if he was moving away from us, or what the hell he was even up to. It's kinda like when you know there's going to be a jump scare in a horror movie. And then I hear Corduroy's wish back towards the Geo, and in my window, he smacks it with the tree branch. May and I panic, and I scoot as close to her as possible. They see the guy back into the woods, then come running back and slamming the branch into the window, like he's jousting with a horse. Thankfully, the window didn't break, but it was terrifying. He did this repetitively. Kathy perks up in her seat, starts pointing out at the road. "I see headlights." She blares the horn and flashes the lights. Lo and behold, it's our savior, Caleb. He brought his older brother, Alex, and they both got out of his car and headed over toward us. May's sobs turn into joyous laughter as her brothers approach. Now Caleb and Alex have always been tall guys. Walking around with them was like walking around with high elves. It felt very safe. Caleb was 6'8", and Alex is around 6'5", so I thought 2 dudes taller than Corduroy Jouster would make him leave. But nope. Caleb walks towards Corduroy, trying to assess the situation, and Alex comes over to the car and taps on the window. He tells Kathy to get out. She does, and he walks over to his car. Then he comes back to put the car in neutral so we can push it off to the side of the road. May and I slowly get out, and May makes a bolt for her brother's car. I help Alex push the car to the side while Caleb distracts the Corduroy, yanks the branch away from Caleb, and starts backing up by going 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, and disappears into the darkness down the street. I can't see him, but Caleb can. The guy backs up pretty far, and then comes launching at Caleb, who sprints the other way down the road. That stick could have really hurt. He bumps past Alex, who had already got out of the Geo and was opening his car door, leaving me behind the Geo alone. Corduroy apparently changed directions and aimed the stick at me, but I couldn't tell. I just heard everybody shouting Elizabeth. This startled me. I jumped inside the Geo, hearing Corduroy smash his stick into the back window with a loud thud in his wish. I take the long way around the car and sprint off into the road and feel Caleb grab my arm and tug me over to Alex's car. I feel like the wind has been knocked out of me. My legs don't seem to work. But Caleb manages to shove me in the back seat, scrambles into the passenger side. But now we're all safe in the car, and Corduroy is standing there like a mantis in front of the headlights again. He'd abandoned his stick and just stood there with no intention to move. Alex puts the car into reverse and slams on the gas, making me knock my head against the door. Then, making the sloppiest U-turn ever, nearly drives us into the woods, but he got us back onto the road. Everybody was in 100% what the fuck mode as Alex tore away, far over whatever the speed limit was. May and Kathy swear they saw Corduroy chasing behind us from Alex. May and Kathy swear they saw Corduroy chasing behind us after Alex made the U-turn, but there was no way he was catching up. The next day, I went back there with Caleb, Kathy, and the guy from the tow truck place. There was no sign of Corduroy anymore, but when we approached the Geo, we saw that in the space where the window didn't close all the way were my cigarettes. The box was missing, but they were all neatly jammed in a row along the window space. I have no doubt it was the work of Corduroy Jouster. To this day, I wonder if he knew I was up the tree and took my cigarettes, or if he thought I dropped them and went further into the woods looking for me, or if he just found them later and decided to stick them through the window, because he was a fucking weirdo after all. I still wonder what the hell his intentions were. I still have so many unanswered questions. This story is about an experience I had on the deep web. For those of you who don't know, the deep web is pretty much the hidden internet. It isn't indexed by search engines, and you need special software to go on it. It is several thousand times bigger than the surface internet, which can be reached by Google, Yahoo, and Bing. It is also home to many illegal things. You can buy stolen guns, any drug you can imagine, stolen phones. You can even hire hitmen. Any illegal thing you can imagine is on the deep web. I never had a great childhood. My dad was gone all the time and my mom was too. When she was home, it was normally verbal and physical abuse. I always needed to have a way to escape it all, whether it was playing video games, watching movies, or even drinking. One day, I was invited over to a friend's house for a sleepover. When I got there, he immediately told me he had something to show me. We went upstairs and he showed me his laptop. He said he had gotten onto the deep web. We stayed up till late at night, browsing through all the interesting things on the deep web. He showed me how to use it and I took some notes. The next day, I decided to try it out for myself. I downloaded the software and I was good to go. When on the deep web, there is a page full of links. In order to go to the sites, you keep clicking on the new links that pop up. At first, it was very boring. Tons of dead websites or disgusting ones filled with videos of real people getting killed. Eventually, I found a forum. I can't remember what it was about, but I asked how to get to any interesting sites that weren't illegal. One guy sent me a link and said it was a site that contained leaked government documents. I thought that was interesting, so I clicked on it. When I pulled up the page, I was pretty fucking shocked. It was a whole bunch of videos of people getting tortured, raped, and murdered in the most horrible of ways. I have a pretty strong stomach, so I was ready to ignore it and just exit out. But I realized that all the videos were playing at once. When I moved the mouse over one, there was no bar that let you pause or stop it. That's when it hit me. These were all thousands of live streams. I clicked on one that said homeless man kidnapped in my basement. In it, a man was tied to a chair covered in blood. To his left was a table, and on it was a whole bunch of tools like axes, knives, drills, hammers. And there was a hooded man standing by it. On the right of the live stream, there was a chat box, and people were requesting the hooded man to do various things, like cut off the homeless man's hand or rip out his hair. Eventually, one man in the chat box said that he would pay several Bitcoin for the hooded man to gouge out the homeless man's eyes. The hooded man agreed and grabbed what looked like a fork off the table and began to walk to the homeless man. I quickly closed the live stream, but I could still hear it. I tried to leave the site, but it was frozen and I could only hear the horrible sounds coming from the stream. A few seconds later, the sounds stopped and a chat box appeared in the center of the screen. I couldn't exit out, but then in the box somebody typed, "Hello, how did you like the site?" I paused for a moment, not sure if it was some kind of automated message, but then he typed again, "Are you going to answer?" I stayed frozen in place, but eventually typed in, "Who is this?" The guy explained that he was the owner of the site, and that he liked to greet first-time users whenever he could. I got a disgusted look on my face, and this is where things got really scary. In the chat box, the man typed, "It's rude to make faces, Jake." My eyes got wide and I noticed my webcam was on, when I always keep it off. Also, how the fuck did he know my name? I quickly covered up the webcam with a sticky note and typed, "How do you know my name? I'm calling the police." There was a brief pause and then horrifyingly, a whole bunch of data was posted in the box. I looked at it and realized what it was. Everything about me, my name, my email, my address, age, it even had all my parents' info as well. I panicked and shut off my computer. I hoped that would be the end of it. I did a complete wipe of my computer's data and went to get a drink. I was under a lot of stress. That night, my mom said she wouldn't be home. She didn't say where she was, but at this point in my life, I didn't care. My dad was of course nowhere to be seen. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up watching a movie. I fell asleep on the couch. I don't know why, but at about 2:30 in the morning I woke up. The TV was still on and it gave off a dim light. But when I opened my eyes a little more, I almost screamed. There was a man standing just a few feet away from me with a mask on. I flew off the couch and darted for the door. I heard heavy footsteps coming after me. I flung open the door and I ran outside screaming as loud as I could, trying to get somebody's attention. I looked behind me and I saw the man. He was running, and he was running faster than me. I screamed louder and I noticed I had tears running down my face. Then, a bag wrapped around my head and I was pushed to the ground with such force I felt blood in my mouth. I heard a car speed up beside me and I was being dragged to the sound of it. They were taking me away and I was probably going to be on that site. I had almost expected death when the man with the mask screamed in pain and dropped me. I pulled the bag off my head and saw a van speed away. And I saw my neighbor hitting the masked man with a baseball bat. The police arrived, took the masked man in, eventually caught the van and shut down the site. My mom and I moved out, and I will never, ever go on the deep web again. And I encourage others to never go on it either. And this story happened to my friend on the deep web. I had a pretty scary experience too, but mine was a few years ago. This story happened to my friend just 1 week ago. To give you some context, this is the friend that showed me how to get on the deep web. He has always been really fascinated with it, but after my horror story experience with deep web hackers, he pretty much took a long break. He didn't resume using the deep web until after about a year of my story, but he didn't tell anyone. He would buy stolen Apple products, drugs, etc. About a week or two ago, he was buying some coke. It wasn't from the seller he normally buys from though. But it was really cheap, so he gave the seller his address and a fake email he used so they could stay in contact until the deal was done. He wasn't too worried. This guy seemed professional, and it was the same procedure for most of his purchases. My friend told him to ship it in a movie case or something that his mom wouldn't expect to have drugs in. This was probably his biggest mistake. He let the man know he was just a teenager, but my friend isn't the most careful of people. A few days later, his mom walks in the room and hands my friend a movie that he had ordered online. He took it and opened it, but inside, there wasn't any cocaine, just a piece of folded paper. He opened it up and read, "There has been a problem. Email me for details." At the bottom, the man had left a new email for my friend to contact. My friend got on his email and asked the guy what the problem was. He responded, "Something has happened. If I were to send it to you, it could be traced back to me, and we would both be caught. Meet me at the elementary school at 7. We'll just do it in person." The school wasn't too far away, so my friend told his mom he was staying the night at my house, and he headed off to meet the man. He called me and asked if I could be there with him, but I was really busy with schoolwork, so I said I couldn't. I did tell him to take a knife or something though, just in case things went south. When he got to the parking lot outside the school, he heard a car honking its horn. He saw it was a Jeep, but the plate had been covered up by duct tape, and the windows were tinted very dark. The man got out of his car and gave my friend the drugs, and my friend paid him. It seemed like everything went fine. My friend got in his car and sat there a bit in order to call and tell me everything was fine. He noticed when he had hung up, the man was still there. Why was he waiting? He didn't think too much of it, so he drove off. When he got to the first red light, he noticed that the man's car was right behind him. He was starting to get a little nervous, but kept driving. When he reached his neighborhood, the man was still following him, so he decided it would be a bad idea to lead him right to his own house. He instead turned into the next neighborhood and took a whole bunch of random turns, hoping to lose the man. Eventually, he no longer saw the car, so he pulled into his garage and called it a day. That night, he noticed the sound of a car engine. He looked out his window and saw the man's car, parked in his driveway. He got wide-eyed and snuck downstairs and peered through the window. Inside the car, the man was smoking a cigarette and talking on the phone. But in the passenger seat, he also saw a second man. The second one was a lot more suspicious looking, even more so than the shady drug dealer man. The second one had messed up hair, a trashy shirt, and while it was hard to see, my friend could almost make out a scar from a massive burn on the side of his neck on his face. He kept watching the two men until the second man began to look at the window more and more often. Eventually, he was just staring at the window my friend was watching them from. My friend decided he had enough. He was going to call the cops. He didn't care if he would get in trouble at this point. He moved away from the window and called the police, who told him to grab a weapon or something to defend himself and wait for them. He had waited about 5 minutes when he saw a figure quietly come out of his mom's room, who was still sleeping. The man shut the door behind him and noticed my friend had seen him. The figure sprinted towards my friend, with what looked like a knife raised in his hand. My friend grabbed a pot from a nearby table and threw it at the figure. It hit him in the face and shattered. The figure screamed and fell to the floor. My friend turned on the lights and saw the second man with the burn, rolling on the floor. His face was covered in blood and shards of glass sticking out. His right eye had tons of blood pouring out. He must have hit him pretty hard. As the man began to slowly get up, my friend grabbed a kitchen knife and drove it into the man's shoulder. Another scream could be heard by the man. The man began to stumble over to the front door when police sirens could be heard. Both men were caught on sight, but my friend's mom had been killed. Her throat had been slit, and she had 23 stab wounds and duct tape covering her mouth. My friend was arrested too for drug possession. His trial's coming up, but he lost his mom because of it. I don't think he'll be buying drugs from the deep web anytime soon. I wasn't what you called hood or hip when I was a teenager. I grew up in the suburbs with a Puerto Rican mother and a Trinidadian father. My household consisted of strict parenting and constant lectures about the horrors drugs can do to your body. Naturally, I rebelled. I took my first puff of a cigarette when I was 14, and I didn't like it until I learned how to inhale. My parents never found out that when I took our dog for a walk, I was also sucking on a cancer stick. If they ever knew that, I would have certainly been punished in the worst possible way. A few blocks down the road from our subdivision was a neighborhood called Fieldstone, where most of my friends lived. Fieldstone was a cluster of low-income houses that always had children in the yard, guys selling or doing drugs, or old men drinking beer and playing dominoes. I loved going to Fieldstone because it was a whole different country compared to the manicured lawns and two-story houses that I lived in. My best friend's name was Nyanka. She and I would go home on 2 different buses, change clothes, watch an episode of Maury, and meet up at Ingalls, the halfway point between our houses. We would walk to her house, or Fieldstone, or do homework, then explore the neighborhood. One hot summer day, as Nyanka and I were walking toward our friend Brittany's house, we passed a man named Key. Key was about 32 and had craters in his face that I later found out were due to his meth use. Nyanka knew him, and we stopped to say hello. Key then invited us to his house to chief. I had no idea what chiefing was until Nyanka whispered that we were about to smoke some weed. I was nervous as hell because of the terrible stories my dad told me about this guy he knew that he smoked one time. He forgot his name and had to put on a straitjacket. I didn't want to look like a chump, so I trusted my friend, put on a brave face, and kept moving. We get to Key's house and his roommate, a 30-something paraplegic that got around in a wheelchair, greeted us. He creeped me out immediately. Here we are, 2 16-year-old girls in this grown man's house with his roommate eyeing me up and down like a juicy steak. We sat down on the couch while Key rolled up and the roommate, whose name was Troy, wheeled his wheelchair right in front of me and just stared. I looked at Nyanka and she was just as cool as a cucumber. Key came out with a blunt in his mouth and it finally reached me. The feeling of THC coursing through my system for the first time was the greatest feeling I ever had. I felt like I could float and I was thinking some pretty awesome thoughts. Everything was hilarious. Key then asked Nyanka to come in the kitchen and she went in and talked to him for a while. When she came back, she told me Key wanted to talk to me. When I got in the kitchen, Key was standing next to a large wad of cash on the counter and straight up asked me, "How much would you want me to give you for you to walk around my house for the rest of the day, butt naked?" I was shocked, stupid and money loving, so I said, $200. Key smiled and said, "Follow me." We went to his bedroom and he tried to kiss me. He had his hands down my pants and I became immediately uncomfortable. Next thing I know, Troy busted through the door and saw us and got upset. "What the fuck are you doing, man? You're supposed to have her ass up, face down." I ran out of the room and told Nyanka what happened. She and I got the hell out of there. I don't remember ever running so fast in my life. We looked back behind us and were terrified to see Troy lifting his legs into his car with one hand and what looked like a gun in his other hand. We looked at each other and sprinted to the main road where for some reason we knew we were safe. Thankfully, my crush was driving by and saw us. He asked if we wanted to go to his house for a kickback. We agreed and got in. When we got to our friend's house, we told them everything, smoked some more and laughed about it. I saw a key again a few times after that, but he never spoke, just hung his head and kept walking. As for Troy, last I heard, he was locked up for raping another one of my classmates and is not expected to be out of jail any time soon. Let me preface this by saying when this happened, I realized I'm an idiot. The biggest, most naive idiot in the world. I thought that because I had lived in so many countries and seen so many cultures that I was smarter than I was and more grown up than my peers. God, I was wrong. So when the story takes place, I'm 14, and I'm attending a boarding school in Connecticut. I'm a female. My family lives in Switzerland, so I only see them on school holidays. I'm going through my emo phase and pretty much pissed off about everyone being mainstream and how preppy my school is. I make friends with the most non-mainstream kids I could find there. At 22, I still kind of cringe at my past self. One of my friends was dating this townie who wanted to be a tattoo artist, and boy did I want a tattoo. I couldn't wait to turn 18. He agreed to tattoo me as he was just learning and didn't have his license, so what harm could happen? Side note, I now have a terrible tattoo, but I digress. We talk and agree that I'll take the bus to Waterbury and meet him on the green, where all the buses meet and transfer, because I had no idea about the layout of the area as I stayed in the campus bubble. If you don't know, Waterbury, Connecticut has its nice parts, but where I was, it was totally gross. Shootings happen regularly, crackheads abound. It's not a good part of town, but back then I didn't really care. I thought I'd be fine. So, it was Saturday. I just finished my classes, and I'm all excited about getting this tattoo and being edgy. I jumped on the bus and texted my friend's boyfriend and said I'm on the way. Fast forward a little bit and I'm at the green, waiting for him to get out of his classes. He texted me to say he will be an hour late. Great. What the hell am I supposed to do in this shitty part of town alone? 2 hours passed and he says he'll be done in an hour. I really wanted this tattoo, so I waited. I've been sitting there for probably 2.5 hours when I noticed this big black SUV pull up and park in the bus drop-off zone. This big black guy then came out, windows tinted, and I didn't know if he was alone. He sat right next to me. There were loads of empty benches, but he chose the one I was on, a red flag. I'm dressed in a band t-shirt, black skinny jeans with Converse, weird colors in my hair, the usual emo regalia. Nothing was revealing, but I stuck out. I thought he just wanted to talk to me because I was different. Again, I'm a total idiot. He then starts asking me what I'm doing there, where I'm from, and how old I am. Because I thought I could take the world on, I boldly told him I was 14, but more mature than people my age, blah blah blah. Then things got weirder. His eyes lit up, and when I say my age, he asks if I'm a virgin and if I've ever given anyone a blowjob. This was where I panicked. I stuttered and my face got red. He laughed and put his arms around my thigh and squeezed. He said I could jump into his car and he'd treat me right and bring me right back in a few hours. I don't know what to do or say. I'm looking around for an adult, but it was a lull and no buses were there. The man tried to pull me closer to him and I was terrified.
Baby girl, it will only be a few hours. Let me show you how a real man does it. Ever had a black dick before? Once you go black, you never go back.
I lose it at this point. I'm nauseous and about to cry. He sees this and smiles even more, clearly enjoying how uncomfortable I am. He then gets up and starts pulling my arm to get me into his car. I try to resist, but it's a 5'8", 140-pound girl against a 6'2", 250-pound black man. He started to get really aggressive when I was resisting, and he really pulled me along. I was about halfway to his car when I heard someone yell, "Hey, get away from her!" The black man got back in his car and drove away as if he was being chased by the cops. He probably thought it was the police, to be honest. I looked at who saved me, and it was a bus driver who was waiting for a shift to start and watching us from nearby Dunkin's. I just fell to the ground and sobbed. I've never been approached by anyone like this. Never been so close to God knows what awful thing this man could have done to me. I was so helpless. The bus driver calls the police and reports the incident, giving a partial of the plate and description. I tried my best to give a description of the guy, but I was in such shock I don't think I was very useful. I didn't hear anything from them later. I assume they didn't find the guy. In the end, I take another bus back to school and don't tell anyone I was nearly abducted and raped, or God knows, even worse. I couldn't stand to have them think I was weak or couldn't take care of myself, and I was so embarrassed by what I had gotten myself into. So I didn't tell anyone until a year ago. I'm back in that part of the world and told one of my high school friends when we drove past that exact spot that happened. And she was shocked. I realized just how in debt I am to that bus driver who literally saved me from being, at the least, abducted. Who knows what that man had in store for me when he got me into his SUV. I ended up meeting with my friend's boyfriend the weekend after, and he made up some bullshit excuse for not meeting me at the agreed upon time, giving me a fake apology. I was so pissed at him after that terrible tattoo he gave me. I don't think I ever talked to him again. About a year ago, I started dating someone who worked as a state park ranger who I'll call Jay. Jay lived on the state park property in a 2-bedroom house tucked in the woods. We set the alarm and settled into bed around midnight with Jay's 2 dogs between us, and a 3rd dog crated beside the bed. For some reason, I just couldn't fall asleep, so I laid listening to the dogs snoring and the deafening silence surrounding us while Jay slept. And then it started. A repetitive bouncing sound of some sort was coming from the outside window less than a few feet away from where I was laying in bed, as if someone was dribbling a basketball on cement. The pace would speed up and slow down. The sound would become louder and softer. This continued for well over 2 hours. I wholeheartedly wanted to believe what I was hearing were simply sounds of nature, so I ignored it. Next came the creaks in the walls. I know that houses make sounds, but this was unlike anything I had ever heard before. These sounds started in the hallway as very, very faint creaks. The creaks became louder as they reached Jay's room, and would happen on one wall at a time, going counterclockwise around the room until eventually reached the wall beside me. The creak in the wall beside me was so loud, I jumped and the dogs jolted from their sleep. All the while, I'm still hearing a bouncing ball outside the window, and I'm getting very nervous by the minute. And then at 3 a.m., I heard it. The most ungodly, terrifying growl shrieking from the center of the house. It was so loud that Jay flies off the bed, grabs a shotgun hanging on the wall adjacent to the bed and shouts, "Is somebody in the house?" He took off down the hallway towards the sound. The dogs are going berserk and I'm in tears, absolutely beside myself, pleading with Jay that it was not a person. Jay came back into the bedroom after not finding an intruder or anything, and said it must have been one of the dogs. I told him it was certainly not the dogs, as I was awake the entire night and the dogs were asleep in the room with us. Maybe an animal got caught underneath the house. Yeah, maybe, I said. Somehow, after I calmed down a bit, I drift off to sleep. The next thing I know, Jay's on top of me with his hands around my throat, with the meanest look on his face, jerking my head back and forth, suffocating me and hurting me. I can't make out any sound and struggling to push Jay away. And that's when I woke up. It was all a vivid dream. Jay is sleeping beside me. In the morning, we walk into the den to find the heater turned on full blast. It was the middle of the summer. Jay only uses it during winter months as its original furnace and quite tricky to operate. I'm convinced something in that house did not want me there. That growl will forever haunt me. This happened a few months ago to me and my girlfriend, referring to her as Jay in this post. When we went on our first holiday together, we had decided to go to Paris, but could only afford 3 days. So we had to cram an awful lot of traveling into a very short space of time. We live in the north of England and we're going to France. Anyway, we arrived at Gare du Nord at 4:30 p.m. local time. Bear in mind, we had been traveling since 3 in the morning and had barely been able to sleep on the journey, so we were completely shattered and just wanted to get to the hotel so we could rest. As we headed for the exit, we noticed several crowds of men gathered around the doors, talking to people going past. However, there was one guy standing away from the crowd, looking around at people going past. He spotted us and came over. He was about the same height as me, around 6 foot, wore a short black overcoat and black trilby hat, and shirt and tie. He was mixed race, slim, with a stubble and short dreads peeking out from under his hat. I'll be honest and say he was fairly handsome. There was nothing especially threatening about him that came to mind. Anyway, he came over and asked if we wanted a taxi. We went along with it and told him we did. He told us to come with him and all smiley and friendly. He led us away from the crowds, through a side door and down a stairwell. That struck me as odd, but it soon became apparent it was a car park. There was some work being done outside the station, so it made sense. The guy then started to strike me as a bit odd. He was almost disarmingly cheerful and friendly, and he kept trying to take Jay's bag for her, even though she repeatedly insisted she was alright. After a minute or so of walking around the car park, we got to his vehicle. This was when I started to get the feeling something was up. It was a nice car, but there was no taxi sign. In fact, there was nothing at all about the car or the guy that screamed taxi to me. He took our bags and put them in the boot. Then what he said next really weirded me out. I don't know why we didn't just leave then. "You get in the back, and you get in the front." He wanted me in the front. That just came across as completely weird, but being idiot tourists who hadn't slept since about 5 p.m. the previous night, we carried on as normal and got in the car. Once inside, he told us that it would cost us 45 euros to get back to our hotel. We were staggered by the cost, but knew that Paris was expensive, and I think we were frankly kidding ourselves by pretending this was just standard procedure on holiday. Anyway, he sped out of the car park and with the radio on full blast. Every time he spoke, he sounded nervous and jittery, high-pitched and peppering his sentences with high-pitched laughter, either like he was in the last place in the world and he wanted to be, or very excited about something. We were both getting a weird feeling at this stage, but he was going way too fast. It was then that a very happy accident happened. Somebody's car had broken down right in the center of the ticket gate, and we were trapped behind them. Our driver leaned out of the window and started shouting and swearing at him in French. His tone of voice was just completely off for normal road rage. He sounded borderline terrified. As car park attendants rushed around the other car to sort out their problem, I took the chance to ask the driver if he had any kind of taxi driver's ID. His face momentarily fell, but he started smiling again pretty soon. He said he didn't understand, but I didn't believe that for a second, because his English had been impeccable up until then. I asked what taxi company he worked for, and he replied with Uber. I kept pressing him for ID, but he kept saying he didn't understand, or that he didn't need one, or some shit like that. It didn't matter. I looked back at Jay, and we both just nodded, and simultaneously got out of the car. He shouted after us, but we were gone. I went out to the boot to get out our luggage, and he sped forward. Jay was still halfway out of the car door, and I thought for one horrible moment he was trying to drive off with our things, or, at worst, with Jay still in the car. But the other car stalled again, and he got about half an inch before the attendants rushed around him and started to shout at him. Some of the attendants came up to us and were very supportive and kind. They told us where to find the real taxi rank and to avoid anyone like that in the future. They told us that they have had a lot of problems with people like this before, and that you could never be too careful. They told us that the best case scenario is you get ripped off for about 40 to 45 euros when you can get a real taxi for 10 euros or less. They didn't tell us what the worst case scenario was, and I'm quite glad about that. Anyway, we found a real taxi driver and he took us to our hotel safely. We got in and went straight to sleep, although we were both a little shaken by what had happened. In retrospect, I think he was probably just aiming to rip us off, but there is still a little part of me that wonders if his demeanor was indicating something more sinister. Call it holiday maker's naivety or whatever. Either way, we both felt so stupid for some time afterward, and we were both so grateful that car encountered problems and the car park attendees were doing their jobs so well. Before the construction of a modern highway, the only route from the Mexican cities of Toluca to Ixtapan de la Sal was a long, dangerous road that winded through a ravine. Traveling on the road in good weather during the day was bad enough, but it was even worse when it was nighttime or raining. Back in the old days, a late-night bus left Ixtapan de la Sal for Toluca in the middle of a storm. A lot of the passengers were sleeping, and the few that were awake stared out the windows and watched the rain fall. Everything was going fine until the bus got off a curve in the road. For no clear reason, the bus's controls began to malfunction and the driver's brakes went out. Those who were awake screamed for the driver to slow down, but he couldn't regain control of the vehicle. "The brakes aren't working," he shrieked back, frantically slamming on the pedal to no avail. As everybody was awake now and panicking, the bus entered the ravine and slammed into a rock wall, killing all of the passengers instantly. Some policemen responded to the call of a bus station that one of its buses was missing. They discovered the scene of the wreckage early in the morning. A few years after the crash, an old bus began to be spotted driving on the same route whenever it was dark and raining out. The bus is a model that isn't made anymore, and although it looks a bit rickety, runs fine. It typically picks up people who are waiting in the middle of highway stops. If you're unlucky enough to get on board this thing, you'll pay your fee and collect your ticket just like on any other bus. The driver, however, is silent, and none of the other passengers talk either. If you try to speak to them, they will ignore you and look straight ahead with very serious expressions on their faces. Once the bus starts to get close to Toluca, the driver will turn his head back and yell for you by name to get off. No matter how much you resist, pointing out that there's not even a stop to get off at, you'll be eventually forced to get up and wait at the door. As you stand and wait, the driver will give you a warning. Wait until the door opens, look back, and you will never get off this bus. So long as you follow the driver's instructions, the door will open after a minute and you'll find yourself in Toluca. Turn around though, and you'll see that all the other passengers have become corpses and skeletons, and the bus will look as wrecked as it did after it made its fatal crash. If you don't die of fear on the spot, then the door will open regardless and you'll step out into Toluca. Die on the bus, however, and you become one of its ghostly passengers, doomed to ride it for all eternity. On the night of February 2nd, 1959, 9 Russian hikers died in a bizarre series of events that have continued to leave investigators and paranormal enthusiasts baffled. As the years have passed, many have returned to the evidence with the hopes of comprehending exactly what happened that night on the northern side of the Ural Mountains. The Dyatlov Pass incident has gone down in history as being one of the strangest cases yet to be solved, and one that many believe may have a genuine paranormal explanation. The story begins with a journey from the Russian town of Visay to the summit of Otorten Mountain that began on January 27, 1959. The hike consisted of 8 men, 2 women. On the morning of the 28th, Yuri Yudin, a member unable to continue the trek due to health problems, headed back to Visay, leaving the final count at 9. Those members remaining were experienced mountaineers and skiers and understood that the particular route ahead was estimated as a level 3, the most difficult track. Eerily enough, it was records and pictures found around the site of their last camp on this pass that helped authorities track the team's movement, until the day preceding the event that has made the Dyatlov Pass so infamous. On January 31st, the team arrived in a woody valley, set up camp for the night, and built a storage for food and equipment that would be used during the return trip. Then, on February 1st, left their camp and began to move through the pass with hopes of setting up camp on the opposite side. Being a Category 3 trek, the unpredictable weather worsened and the team deviated west towards Kalat Sakil. There at the slope of the mountain, the group made the decision to stop and set up camp for the night. What really happened to the hikers next is a mystery that has left countless people guessing for years. It took 24 days for the first search mission to get underway, a party that also included Yuri Yudin, the friend that turned back days earlier. After several days of following along the trail, the search party arrived at the Kalat Sakil Pass and were shocked to find the remains of the badly damaged tents. The tent in question had been ripped open, not from the outside, but from the inside, almost as if the team had been forced to flee in the middle of the night. At the edge of the nearby pine forest, the remains of a small fire were found, along with the first 2 bodies dressed shoeless and only in underwear. 630 meters from the edge of the forest, where the first 2 bodies were discovered, 3 more bodies were found and posed in such a way to suggest that they were attempting to return to the campsite. A medical examination of the first 5 bodies concluded the death of all 5 due to hypothermia. But it wasn't until 4 months later, when the remaining 3 bodies were discovered in a stream valley further into the woods, that the story would become much more mysterious. When the final 3 bodies were examined by a coroner, it was discovered that all 3 died not from hypothermia, but from fatal injuries sustained to the body. The first from severe skull damage, and the final 2 bodies were determined to have died of major chest fractures. Oddly enough, there was no external wounds on any of the bodies, though experts have compared the internal damage to that of a high-speed car accident. It was as if the remaining 3 bodies had been crushed by a high level of applied pressure. It's also important to point out that one of the women was missing her tongue. Doctors suggested that the sheer force required to inflict the injuries that the body sustained could not have been man-made. Further investigation indicated that no other people had been traveling through Kalat Sakil or in the surrounding areas aside from the missing hikers. So how could the bodies have sustained such tremendous injuries? Initially, the first 2 theories involved the Mansi, local indigenous people, who some speculated could have killed the group for intruding upon their territory. Investigation of the area did not support the theory though, as the snow showed no sign of struggle and only the hikers' footprints were observable in the icy landscape. Some have even speculated that the team had been blinded during the night because of the white pine branches they had used, instead of the nearby dry kindling that they used to start the small fire located from the tent. The only thing the search party could establish for certain was that Dyatlov's team had quickly left the camp on their own accord in the middle of the night, dressed far too scantily for the storm that would have been occurring at the same time. Some of the men and women were only wearing one shoe, while others merely socks and sections of clothes ripped from those who were presumably already dead. Later, when forensic radiation tests were conducted, surprisingly high doses of radioactive contamination were found to be present on a few of the victims and their clothing. 50 kilometers south of the Kalatsikil, another group of hikers later reported seeing strange orange globes in the sky, likely in the direction of the hikers' camp during the night of the incident. Some reports have even suggested that a large quantity of strange scrap metal had been found in the area. From February to March of 1959, others, including the Meteorology Service and the military, also reported seeing the strange mystery orbs in the night sky. Since then, there have been numerous stories surrounding the incident, everything from a military UFO cover-up to a possible meteor crash, neither supplying much in the way of answers to what really happened on that February night. Many of the journalists and writers who had been given special permission to observe the original case files have since claimed much of that information, as is a mysterious envelope that is made mention of in the evidence list. Though no one is able to verify whether the above claims are actually true, the many who believe in the possibility of a military cover-up see this as probable evidence to suggest that a cover-up did in fact happen. The Dyatlov Pass incident has been deemed as one of the strangest unsolved mysteries of its time and has left skeptics, investigators, and paranormal enthusiasts alike scratching their heads as they try to piece together a possible explanation to the bizarre and unfortunate sequence of events. In Ekaterinburg, the Dyatlov Foundation was founded with the hopes of encouraging Russian officials to reopen the investigation and to finally put an end to all of the speculation. In the swell of possibility and curiosity that has since surrounded the incident, the Foundation aims to keep the memory to the 9 dead hikers alive in the hope that one day, the answers to the question will be found. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly, I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how the first idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point you fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights. Every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and I was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo. The terrors that distracted me, I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor." Or, "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim, and it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a little. A very, very little crevice in the lantern, so I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily until, at length, a simple dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, as a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to me ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum simulates the soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw upon the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. Ha ha! When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who had introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still, they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness. Until, at length, I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. More vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles, in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still then the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard it not? Almighty God! No, they heard it. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 and louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. I was hiding in the pantry when the Axeman killed my father. The farmhouse where we now lived was dark, save for the garish red, blue, and green fairy lights that flickered on our living room Christmas tree, and would be silent were it not for my father's sobs. The moans issued by our wooden floor under the Axeman's heavy footsteps, and the tiny robotic rendition of Bing Crosby's White Christmas blaring from a toy Santa decoration in the hall. All this I could see and hear through a tiny opening in the pantry floor. The smell of all that stinking, rotting blood fought with the sense of the herbs and spices lining the wall racks around me, making me feel somewhat removed from the situation, as though I was just sitting and watching this theater of nightmares from afar. My father knelt in the semi-darkness of the hallway, his weeping body facing away from me, curled into a Z, head bowed, wrists bound with metal wire like the others. Hands caked in brownish dry blood from struggling against his bindings, almost like he was praying in his own strange, awful way. The Axeman, who had just finished up with whatever was left of our maid Petra, was stepping out into the light. His heavy boots made the floorboards whine and creak in protest, as though his steps caused them pain. Blood soaked and matted into his trousers and splattered the blue and off-white lumberjack shirt that just about held his bloated frame in place. Like those bodies you see dredged from rivers and lakes weeks after they've been thrown in, now bulging and contorted from the water they've absorbed. At least 7 feet up from his boots rested a head so vile that it looked like the furthest thing from human, and forced me to choke back vomit in my own throat. The X-Men, his lopsided face a mess of warts, scars, and tumorous growths, twisted those fat purple lips of his into a grin over his rotted chalk teeth. His eyes of uneven size and distance seemed to roll around independently of one another, scanning the hallway in different directions. Neither one pointed towards my father's crouching body, but his attention didn't seem to be anywhere else.
"Please, you don't have to do this. Don't kill me,"
my father sobbed, barely managing to spit out coherent sentences.
"We have money. We can pay you."
At the mention of payment, the X-Man's thick fingers tightened around the gnarled hand of his great axe, as though he took offense at the idea of being bought off so easily. I'd never gotten a good look at his axe before now. It was a broad axe, like the ones he used in the adjacent forest long ago, where they felled wooden trees rather than family trees. With an unintelligible grunt, the Axeman hefted his axe high above his head, and before I or my father could scream, he brought it down with a swift slice and the thunderous crunch of the metal on wood. I winced in shock. The Axeman gave a strained exhalation, and my father's head came tumbling to the ground. His decapitated body seemed slumped forward, spraying twin arcs of bright arterial blood, painting the wall and floor with a puddle of sickening ruby. His head was facing me now, dead but not serene, frozen in a state of shock, with rivulets of blood dribbling from his nose and mouth. I threw up in my mouth and gulped it down with a shudder, seeing my dad's fingers twitch as the Axeman stepped over his body and ambled into the living room out of my sight. Strands of hair were plastered to my cheeks with hot tears, and snot from my silent weeping gathered on the cusp of my upper lip. It was all happening again. Rumors had flown around for years about the curse of Winterview Lodge, just half-whispered mutterings exchanged between reliable mutual friends of mutual friends. My dad knew about that when he bought it, of course, but why would it stop him? Adults don't believe in monsters and curses as much as they don't believe in the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus, whose tiny robotic counterpart was on the 5th loop of White Christmas. With all that had gone on, the place was a steal. Going by real-world rationale, it'd be stupid not to buy it. The last incident was back in the snowstorm of '65, a decade before my parents were even born. It was the Bartoks back then, a family of Polish immigrants who had moved in the States after World War II to have children and start a new life. Legend has it, they heard rustling in the attic in the weeks leading up to the awful storm. Food went missing, there were footsteps leading in from the forest to the farmhouse, but never beyond. Of course, those parts were only rumors. The Bartok family were found butchered in their home when the snow cleared. The mother at the base of the attic, the maid in the games room, the father in the hallway. No signs of theft, exit, or entry. No sign of a murder weapon or a killer. They were there for weeks before the authorities managed to find them, and whoever had done them in was long gone by then. But perhaps even stranger than that was the fate of Kate Kapkor Bartok, their 10-year-old son. No sign of his body or even his death was ever found. It was as though he had disappeared from the face of the earth, But stranger still, another young boy, who to this day had never been identified, but was most definitely not a member of the Bardic family, was found dead in his place. Police labeled the John Doe boy's death as natural causes. We'd moved in a week before the snowstorm started, back before I even knew what happened here. There were no footprints in the snow, no missing food, no rustling from the attic. Even when the first inklings of the snowstorm were brewing in the distant clouds, everything in the house was business as usual. There were no warnings of this true storm about to come. Nothing amiss that could have helped us escape. When the wind was already howling outside the windows of the Winterview lodge, carrying lashings of snow, there was an almighty thumping coming from the attic. My mother, rational as she was, figured that it must have been a possum or maybe a stray cat that had gotten trapped during the snowstorm. She stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkness, not realizing that two bulging mismatched eyes were staring back at her. Without a second's hesitation, the axeman came rumbling down the stairs at her like cancer and buried the axe in her skull. She let out a scream reflexively, like nothing I've ever heard before, and like nothing I'll ever hear again, until a second swing of the axe left her with only half a bottom jaw. She collapsed in a wheezing, bloody heap as the axeman trudged downstairs to deal with the rest of us. The batteries in the singing sanatoy were beginning to run out, morphing Bing's sonorous tones into the garbled electronic gibberish. I realized in that moment that it was now or never, and that the Santa's singing would hopefully mask my footsteps if I tried to escape. I nudged the pantry door open gingerly and slid out through the gap. Still no sign of the axeman. I just had to keep my eyes averted from the ground to avoid seeing my father's headless corpse. I crept through the hallway over the blood, around the body, and suppressed a gasp of shock when I saw the axeman sitting on an armchair in the living room, the blood-drenched axe resting on his lap, his piggish eyes transfixed on the lights of the Christmas tree in almost childlike amazement. He looked like disease personified, pestilence without his white horse. I tiptoed through the games room, which was just left of the front door, my only way out of this nightmare. Outside, the snowstorm still raged violently, but now that awful stench of death was becoming stifling. I'd rather freeze to death in the woods than meet my end at the axeman's blade, all torn and butchered like my father, my mother, and Petra. Oh dear God, Petra. It was the first time I'd seen her since the axeman had mutilated her, and even after seeing my father's head struck from his body as he cowered on the ground, I wasn't ready for her. What was once Petra now rested against the wall of the games room, just like the maid of the Bardics had done all those years ago. Her belly torn open, gave way to glistening ropes of bowel that filled her lap. The axe wounds in her arms and legs looked like she'd been half-eaten by a giant rat, and the wound to her throat dressed her in an apron of dark, clotted red. Worst of all was the axe wound inflicted on her face, while her eyes were dead and glazed over. It looked like her forehead was grinning a deep, bloody, lipless grin. I couldn't suppress the shriek that came out of me next. It rivaled even my mother's as the axeman hacked her to death. Of course he heard it, and I felt my blood leave my skin as I heard him thundering down the hallway behind me, his boots splashing in the pool of my dad's jellied blood. The Santa Claus ranted its mechanical nonsense as I turned my head towards the axeman, whose hideous bulbous face was mere inches away from mine. It felt like a living mask, a mask of flesh, of animated meat. Cancer flesh. Networks of veins pulse under his ruddy skin, joining in nexuses under the tumorous mountain of misshapen muscle and cartilage. He was both alive and dead in ways that can only really be described as thoroughly unnatural. I was too afraid to think, too afraid to cry, too afraid to even move. The axeman wheezed and gurgled in his throat, breath stinking of decay. He held the axe out in front of him and gestured for me to grab the handle, which for reasons beyond my understanding, I did. I can't carry it anymore. I'm too tired. It hurts too much. The axeman croaked. He spoke in a voice that didn't fit him, the voice of a child with a thick Polish accent. My other hand extended and grabbed the handle of the axe as the axeman's grip loosened and his twisted hands pulled away. It was so deceptively light, so easy to hold, such a perfect fit for my hands. The axeman stepped back and fell to his knees, in the same pose of a benediction he made my father assume before he executed him a few feet away. The axeman's diseased skin seemed to harden and become gray and lifeless, assuming the qualities of porcelain. Cracks began to travel over his body and chunks of crystallized flesh fell away, shattering and dematerializing into nothingness on the floor. I thought of those time-lapse videos of caterpillars becoming butterflies in their chrysalises as the body of the axeman fell away and vanished to reveal something small and frail inside. The axeman was gone. In his place lay the corpse of Kakper Bardok, not a scratch on him, a beautiful corpse. It was me alone now, all alone. Just myself and the axe. My father lay headless a few feet away, Petra mutilated in the games room, my mother hacked to death upstairs. The body of Kakper Bardok, dead of natural causes, right before my feet. For some reason, the situation suddenly struck me as funny. Really, really funny. For God knows what reason. I just couldn't stop laughing. It kept coming and coming, and I found myself walking upstairs with the axe in hand, laughing hysterically at the whole situation. God, the curse of Winterview Lodge. Hilarious. Who'd have thought, right? Certainly not me. I reached the upstairs landing and saw my mother's twitching corpse there, her face a catastrophe of tooth, meat, and bone, and I still just couldn't stop laughing. Eventually, the laughing turned to wheezing as my face and my body seemed to grow heavy with strain. It felt so strange, and so right that my grip tightened on the axe, and I gave it a swing, effortlessly tearing away a chunk of banister. It was meant to be. A pool of wet crimson was expanding on the laminate flooring below my mother's mangled face, and I caught my reflection in it. The axeman's face staring back at me through the red, and I realized that it wasn't a curse, but a duty. Winterview Lodge always needs an axeman. I headed up the stairs to the attic, chuckling and wheezing, dragging the axe behind me. I knew it would be a very long winter before I woke up again to see the new family. But I'll wait. I've got all the time in the world.